For decades, the refusal remained sealed behind palace doors, hidden beneath careful smiles and perfectly controlled appearances. Now, a former royal dresser has broken her silence, revealing that Diana personally asked Queen Elizabeth II for one extraordinary jewel, Queen Mary's Richmond brooch. The answer was not delayed, softened, or disguised. The monarch refused, and according to the woman who witnessed Diana's reaction, that single word cut far deeper than anyone inside the palace understood. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Eleanor Harcourt carried the memory for years before recounting it in a recorded interview. She had served as a senior royal dresser, preparing gowns and jewels for engagements. A royal dresser is a trusted household aide who helps a senior family member prepare for official appearances and handles jewelry under strict palace rules. Eleanor knew which pieces required the monarch's direct consent. Diana chose Queen Mary's Richmond brooch for a charity gala because its meaning reached beyond beauty. The diamond and pearl heirloom had passed through generations and remained guarded by Elizabeth II. An heirloom is a treasured object handed down within a family, but inside the monarchy, such a jewel could also signal continuity, rank, and trust. The princess, wearing it once, would show that the queen finally saw her not as an outsider, but as part of the dynasty's future. Eleanor entered the dressing room carrying the answer. Diana stood beside the open jewelry case, with gloves between her fingers, imagining the brooch against her gown. Then the words came. Elizabeth had refused permission to release it. The princess did not protest. Her expression simply changed. She lowered her eyes, folded the gloves once, then folded them again, as though keeping her hands occupied could stop the disappointment from showing. Eleanor explained that Diana never wanted to claim the piece as her own. She wanted the monarch to trust her with it for one evening. That distinction made the rejection brutal. Crowds adored her, charities depended on her, and the crown placed her before the world as its brightest promise. Yet behind closed doors, one guarded jewel told her that admiration was not acceptance. Refusal also appeared in the jewelry room record, the official log used to track royal pieces and authorization. Beside the brooch, a handwritten instruction declared that it must remain reserved exclusively for the sovereign. Diana said nothing that afternoon. Days later, however, she requested a private conversation with the queen. The brooch had been locked away, but the deeper wound could not be contained because for Diana, the refusal was never truly about diamonds. To the outside world, Elizabeth and Diana stood on the same balcony, served the same institution, and belonged to the same royal family. Behind closed doors, however, they understood loyalty in profoundly different ways. The Queen saw inherited jewels as symbols of duty that had to be protected from emotion. Diana saw them as signs of trust. Between those two beliefs stood the Richmond brooch and a young princess, desperate to know whether the family she had entered would ever truly claim her. Diana carried one of the most admired titles in the world, yet admiration did not equal authority. As Princess of Wales, the title given to the wife of the heir to the throne, she represented the monarchy's future beside Charles, attended major ceremonies, and drew enormous public affection. Still, the most important royal jewels remained under Elizabeth's control. Every loan required permission, and every request reminded the princess that popularity outside the palace did not guarantee acceptance within it. Elizabeth viewed those heirlooms through a colder, more disciplined lens. A royal heirloom is a historic object passed through generations, often carrying family memory and institutional meaning. To the monarch, each jewel belonged to a chain of duty that had begun long before Diana arrived and would continue after them both. To Diana, jewelry could hold love, motherhood, and identity. A brooch connected to the queen was not merely decoration, it was a message. Diana admitted this quietly to Eleanor Harcourt while they prepared for an engagement. The former dresser later preserved the exchange in a recorded account, explaining that the princess felt celebrated by strangers, but constantly examined by the family around her. Every request seemed to become another hidden test. Every answer carried a judgment she had not been allowed to see coming. Eleanor listened as Diana confessed that she never knew whether she was being guided, corrected, or kept at a distance. Elizabeth read the request alone and paused over Diana's name. The monarch placed her pen down, considered the Richmond piece, and instructed that another brooch be offered instead. She chose a smaller floral jewel, believing the substitute was generous and appropriate. Diana saw something else, a carefully measured reminder that affection had limits and rank had boundaries. Charles knew how much the original piece mattered to his wife, but he refused to challenge his mother, afraid that intervening over her personal collection would deepen tensions already pressing against the marriage. His silence protected the Queen's authority, but it left Diana alone with the rejection. A replacement might have ended the matter. It did not. Diana had seen the Richmond brooch before. Long before the formal refusal, Diana had held the brooch in her own hands, and what happened in that room transformed a royal ornament into a promise she believed had already been made. The true beginning of the conflict came not at the charity gala, during a quiet Windsor castle, fitting months earlier. Diana had entered the jewelry room, expecting to select a modest piece for an official dinner. Instead, a velvet tray was opened before her, revealing the Richmond brooch beneath the lamps. She lifted it carefully, and for several seconds, no one stopped her. Then the Queen entered, and one restrained exchange turned private fascination into a royal point of no return. Diana arrived at Windsor Castle in February 1989, while preparations were underway for a held Commonwealth diplomatic dinner. The Commonwealth is an association of nations, many with historical links to Britain, whose representatives often attend formal royal events. As Princess of Wales, she was expected to appear polished, confident, and worthy of standing beside the future king. Yet every choice she made inside the palace remained subject to approval. Eleanor Harcourt opened a selection tray containing several historic jewels that afternoon. The former royal dresser later described the encounter in a recorded account, explaining that the Richmond brooch had been temporarily removed from Elizabeth's jewels' private collection for inspection. Eleanor understood the rules surrounding such pieces, but she also saw Diana's expression change the instant the diamonds and pearl came into view. Diana lifted the brooch and held it against her blue dress. She smiled, asking Eleanor whether it might one day be appropriate for her to wear. The question sounded harmless, almost hopeful. Eleanor began to answer carefully, but footsteps interrupted her before she could finish. Elizabeth entered without warning, and immediately noticed the jewel in Diana's hand. The Queen did not raise her voice. She simply said that the piece was not available. Diana's smile disappeared. She returned it to the tray at once, apologized, and stepped back while the staff remained painfully silent. The monarch moved on to another matter. The princess could feel the humiliation settling around her. Senior courtier approached Diana after Elizabeth had left. Courtier is a trusted palace official who serves senior royals and helps enforce household customs. He explained that certain jewels represented closeness to the sovereign and could not be granted merely because they suited a gown. His words were meant as guidance. Diana, they sounded like a warning about knowing her place. Diana later told Eleanor that the Queen's refusal had felt permanent. She believed Elizabeth had not merely protected a brooch. She had judged the princess for reaching toward something above her permitted rank. Eleanor remembered that confession because Diana spoke without anger. Pain was quieter than that. Months later, Diana deliberately requested the same jewel for the charity gala. She was no longer choosing an accessory. She was testing whether the Queen's judgment had changed. When the formal request finally reached the monarch, both women understood that it carried the weight of their first encounter, and this time, Diana would not allow silence to deliver the final word. There were no cameras, no advisors seated between them, and no crowd to soften the silence. Diana entered the Queen's private sitting room, determined to ask one question directly. Why was she trusted to represent the crown before millions, yet not trusted to wear one of its brooches for a single evening? Elizabeth remained composed. Diana did not. What followed was not a shouting match, but something more dangerous, a calm confrontation in which every carefully chosen word exposed years of pain. Diana had requested the meeting 2 days after the formal refusal, insisting that Charles and the senior courtiers remain outside. A private audience is a confidential meeting granted by the sovereign, usually protected from public scrutiny and palace interruption. For the princess, it offered the only chance to speak without her feelings being filtered through aides. For Elizabeth, it meant facing the woman behind the public role. The queen sat beside a writing table, her hands resting near a stack of correspondence. Diana remained standing for several seconds, gripping the back of a chair as though sitting would make her appear weaker. Elizabeth invited her to take the seat opposite. She obeyed, but the tension did not ease. Diana asked whether the refusal had been caused by security, protocol, or something personal. Royal protocol is the system of customs governing conduct, access, and rank within the monarchy. Elizabeth answered that not every possession in the royal collection was intended to circulate among family members. Her voice stayed calm. The message did not. Diana finally said what had been building inside her. She was expected to represent the crown before enormous crowds, comfort grieving families, and stand beside the future king as the face of continuity. Yet inside the palace, she was still treated as though trust had to be rationed. The princess told Elizabeth that every restriction made her wonder whether she belonged to the Way family or merely worked for it. Elizabeth did not retreat. She admitted that the Richmond brooch carried a personal connection to Queen Mary and represented authority she was unwilling to surrender. The monarch insisted that protecting it was not a punishment. Diana heard the distinction, but it brought no comfort. The jewel had become proof that duty could be offered publicly while affection remained withheld privately. Eleanor Harcourt later described the aftermath in a recorded interview. She remembered Diana leaving the room pale but controlled, closing the door with deliberate gentleness before reaching a side corridor. There, beyond the audience rooms and away from public eyes, the princess broke down. Eleanor stayed beside her until she could speak again. Confrontation did not change Elizabeth's decision. It did, however, forced the queen to explain everything to Charles. Diana had finally confronted the source of the decision, but the next battle would be shaped by the man caught between the woman he married and the mother whose authority he had rarely challenged. Charles could have challenged the refusal. He could have asked his mother to reconsider, offered to assume responsibility for the brooch, or simply acknowledged why the decision had wounded his wife. Instead, when Elizabeth explained her reasoning, he remained measured and cautious. That silence preserved royal protocol, but it left Diana isolated. Behind the jewel now stood something far more powerful than personal preference: the machinery of inheritance, rank, and a future king unwilling to oppose the sovereign. Elizabeth held complete control over the jewels she considered part of her private collection. Unlike institutional property, which belongs to the crown as an enduring public body, personal royal property remains under the owner's direct authority. The queen could decide which pieces were loaned, who wore them, and when they returned. Diana's title gave her prominence, but it did not give her access. Charles understood that boundary better than anyone. As heir to the throne, the person next in line to become monarch, he carried enormous influence. That influence was not command. He could advise his mother. He could not overrule her concerning a jewel she regarded as personally hers. Challenging Elizabeth would have meant more than questioning taste. It would have meant testing the limits of her authority. Charles returned to the apartment after speaking with the queen and found Diana waiting. He avoided her eyes as he explained that the brooch was not worth creating a constitutional family dispute. Constitutional dispute within the royal household is a conflict that risks blurring the monarch's authority, the heir's role, and the rules governing their conduct. To him, restraint protected stability. To his wife, it sounded like surrender. Diana opened the box containing the smaller floral brooch. She lifted it out, studied it briefly, then placed it on the table between them. The princess told Charles that the jewel itself had never been the point. The message was, Elizabeth had decided what level of trust Diana deserved, and he had chosen not to question it. Eleanor Harcourt later disclosed in a documented interview that a palace memorandum followed the confrontation. A memorandum is an internal written instruction used to record recommendations or decisions. It advised against lending historically important pieces to Diana unless the queen approved, each appearance personally. Eleanor understood what that meant. The restriction had hardened into policy. A senior aide warned Elizabeth that such control might deepen Diana's belief that the monarchy valued her popularity while distrusting her independence. Queen listened, then refused to change course. Gala arrived with the Richmond brooch still locked away. Diana did not wear the floral substitute. Queen had protected her authority. Charles had protected the peace. Diana was left to walk into the ballroom, carrying a message of her own. On the night of the charity gala, every camera waited to see what Diana would wear. Palace aides expected the approved floral brooch. Instead, the princess arrived with no royal brooch at all. Round her neck was a piece from her personal collection, chosen without permission and worn with unmistakable confidence. To the public, it was simply elegant. Inside the palace, everyone understood the gesture. Diana had obeyed the queen's refusal, but she would not wear the consolation prize. Diana prepared in silence, while Eleanor Harcourt placed the approved substitute beside her gown. The former royal dresser waited for an answer, knowing that the smaller jewel had been selected by Elizabeth herself. A royal loan is permission to wear an item owned and controlled by another member of the family for a specific occasion. Accepting that piece would have appeared respectful, but to the princess would also have suggested that the rejection no longer mattered. Eleanor watched Diana open her personal jewelry case and remove a sapphire and pearl necklace. The piece belonged to her, which meant she needed no palace authorization and violated no rule by wearing it. That distinction gave the choice its power. Queen could control access to the Richmond brooch, but she could not order Diana to display the replacement. Diana studied herself for several moments before telling Eleanor that she would rather attend without a royal heirloom than pretend the floral jewel carried the same meaning. She did not sound furious. She sounded resolved. The princess understood that refusal could take many forms, and this would be hers. Quiet, lawful, and impossible to misunderstand. Charles noticed the missing brooch the moment he saw his wife at the gala. His expression tightened, and his eyes moved briefly toward the necklace. He knew why Diana had chosen it, yet the prince said nothing as she stepped forward to greet the guests with warmth and confidence. The crowd saw grace. He saw a private argument continuing beneath every smile. Elizabeth received a photograph from the event the following morning. The monarch recognized the necklace immediately and understood that its presence had answered her decision. Diana had not openly defied the queen, but she had rejected the substitute with equal clarity. Elizabeth set the photograph down without comment, though those around her sensed that the message had landed. Eleanor later stated, in a recorded interview, that the Richmond brooch was soon returned to deeper storage. Its movements became so restricted that even routine inspection required direct authorization from the sovereign. The Queen had closed the matter through control. Diana had closed it through choice. Years later, however, the princess finally explained what she had wanted from Elizabeth. It was never ownership. Diana had answered the palace through absence. The meaning of that empty space would only become clear during one final, unguarded conversation. Years after the gala, Diana and Eleanor sat alone while dresses were being packed away following an engagement. There were no courtiers nearby, and no official schedule pressing them forward. Eleanor asked why the Richmond brooch had mattered so much, when Diana already possessed jewels admired across the world. The princess paused, ran one finger along the edge of an empty velvet case, and gave an answer. It transformed the entire conflict from a dispute over luxury into a confession about love. Diana had returned to Kensington Palace after one of her final major engagements as a working royal. A working royal is a member of the family who carries out official duties on behalf of the monarch. That role had once placed her at the center of public life. But now, every appearance carried the weight of an ending. She was exhausted, no longer protected by certainty, and more willing to speak than Eleanor had ever known her to be. Eleanor Harcourt packed the remaining jewelry cases while the princess sat at her dressing table, watching memories disappear into velvet compartments. The former dresser later preserved the conversation in a private recorded testimony. She remembered Diana speaking slowly, as though she had carried the answer for years, but had never found a safe place to release it. Diana admitted that she had never expected to own the Richmond brooch. She understood that it belonged to Elizabeth and carried memories connected to Queen Mary. Ownership had not been the dream. Trust had. The princess had wanted the monarch to place something personally precious in her hands and believe that she would protect it. Diana explained that a loan would have meant acceptance from a woman whose approval she had spent years trying to understand. A royal jewelry loan is temporary permission to wear a piece while ownership remains unchanged. To the palace, such an arrangement was practical. To her, it would have felt deeply personal. Elizabeth would have been saying, without affection or ceremony, that Diana could be trusted with part of the family's history. Diana then revealed the plan she had never shared. After the gala, she intended to return the brooch herself and thank the Queen privately. She hoped that simple act might create a warmer conversation between them, one without aids, rules, or suspicion. The princess had not been reaching for status. She had been reaching for Elizabeth. Eleanor finally understood the cruelty of the misunderstanding. The Queen had protected an heirloom, believing she was defending continuity. Yet she had unknowingly rejected Diana's carefully hidden request for emotional recognition. One woman guarded an object. The other had asked to be embraced. Years later, Eleanor's testimony would reach the public. One photograph and one newspaper headline would turn that quiet confession into a national judgment. What had once been hidden inside a velvet case was about to become public, and the world would judge the refusal by a standard far different from palace protocol. The revelation broke across Britain with the force of a story people felt they already understood. It was not the value of the brooch that dominated the reaction, but the image of Diana asking for a sign of trust and receiving a closed door instead. Newspapers, broadcasters, and crowds returned to the same painful contrast. The woman, embraced by millions, had once stood inside the palace, seeking acceptance from a single person, and even that modest hope had been denied. Eleanor Harcourt's account reached the public through a televised royal documentary, where she identified the Richmond brooch and described Diana's reaction in the jewelry room. A royal documentary is a factual-style television program examining the monarchy through interviews, records, and personal testimony. Eleanor repeated the detail that struck viewers hardest. After hearing the refusal, the princess had lowered her eyes and folded her gloves rather than challenge the Queen. Palace representatives responded within hours. They defended Elizabeth's right to control personal heirlooms, explaining that such jewels belonged to the monarch privately rather than to the institution of the crown. Yet the officials did not dispute Eleanor's description of Diana's pain. That silence mattered. It suggested that the palace could defend the rule, not erase the emotional cost of enforcing it. William watched a recording of the interview in private. The prince remained composed until Eleanor described his mother folding those gloves again and again. His expression tightened. He replayed the passage, hearing how Diana had hidden humiliation behind perfect control. To him, the story was no longer about a jewel. It was about a moment when she had stood alone. Charles received the morning newspapers without speaking. King paused over an account, describing how he had refused to intervene, and turned the front page face down. He had once believed silence would prevent a family conflict. Now that silence had become part of the accusation, he could not answer it without reopening wounds the monarchy had spent years containing. The Morning Chronicle captured the public mood with brutal simplicity. Its front page carried a full-page photograph of Diana at the gala without a brooch, beneath the tointe de corace, the jewel she was never trusted to wear. The image transformed absence into evidence. What she had not worn became more powerful than anything the palace could display. Admirers gathered outside Kensington Palace by afternoon, carrying pearl-shaped white flowers. They arranged them beside the gates in the form of a brooch, turning private sadness into a public tribute. The crowd had reached its verdict, but history still demanded something deeper. The world had delivered its emotional judgment. What remained was the harder verdict, what the refusal revealed about Diana, Elizabeth, and the monarchy they both struggled to serve. Queen Mary's Richmond brooch was never loaned to Diana. The Queen's decision held, The jewel remained under sovereign control, and palace protocol was preserved exactly as Elizabeth intended. Yet history did not remember the episode as a victory for royal discipline. It remembered a princess asking to be trusted, and a monarch unable to hear the emotional plea hidden inside that request. The diamonds stayed behind palace walls. The meaning escaped, and it belonged permanently to Diana. Elizabeth never reversed the refusal. Diana never wore the Richmond brooch at a public engagement, a private royal gathering, or any family occasion. Sovereign control meant that the monarch retained complete authority over the piece and could decide whether it left her collection. The Queen exercised that authority without compromise, ensuring that the jewel remained connected to her alone. Elizabeth regarded the brooch as a personal inheritance, not simply a royal ornament. It carried memories of Queen Mary, whose discipline and devotion had shaped the monarchy through uncertain years. For the sovereign, protecting it meant guarding continuity and preserving a private connection to the past. She was not prepared to share that connection, even with the woman expected to stand beside the future king. Diana had never attempted to seize status. She had not demanded ownership, permanent access, or control. The princess wanted one unmistakable sign that she was trusted within the family she represented. Crowds welcomed her without hesitation. Public love could not replace private acceptance. She needed Elizabeth to recognize the difference. The monarch never did. Elizabeth's refusal was not driven by theatrical hatred. Her restraint was quieter and more complicated. Queen protected herself through distance, controlled emotion through rules, and treated caution as responsibility. Yet that restraint became so severe that caution felt like rejection. She guarded the brooch successfully, while losing the chance to answer Diana with tenderness. Eleanor Harcourt resolved the central mystery through her recorded testimony. A former dresser explained that borrowing something precious to Elizabeth would have meant more to Diana than possessing any jewel of her own. The princess wanted trust, not diamonds. She wanted a connection that could not be purchased, inherited, or commanded. Charles remained silent. Elizabeth remained rigid. Diana answered through quiet defiance. Together, their choices revealed the monarchy's deepest weakness. It could communicate rank perfectly, while struggling to express affection. Diana lost the brooch, but she won the deeper legacy. The royal family protected an object. She exposed the human cost of protecting tradition without tenderness. And so the Richmond brooch remained in the royal collection, while Diana's unanswered request became the more enduring inheritance, a final reminder that the crown's greatest failures were never measured in diamonds, but in the moments when compassion was withheld. Thanks for watching. Please, don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.